Hello everyone and welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to be discussing creating your first Django project. In future lectures, we'll actually discuss the difference between a Django project and a Django application. But by the end of this lecture, we should be able to actually run a Django project, a little server locally, and see it in our browser. In case you haven't done so already, you'll need to install Django. You can do that either with a conda install Django or for a normal Python distribution, pip install Django. And remember, if you're using a virtual environment, you should activate the virtual environment before running any of the commands that we actually do throughout this section of the course. So when you install Django, it's actually also going to install a command line tool called Django-admin. And this command line tool is just a useful feature for us to quickly run things straight from the command line. So what we can do is create our first project. And for that, just go to your command prompt, activate your virtual environment if you haven't done so already, and then say Django-admin space start project space and then whatever you want your project to be called. In this case, we will say first_project. And then you're going to get something that looks like this. And we'll explain what all these files are in just a second. But before we do, let's actually run this code. I'm going to jump to the Atom text editor, open up a command prompt, and run through this. Alright, here I am at the Atom text editor. What I will do is open up a new terminal or command prompt, and I'm going to change directory to my desktop and actually make a new folder. So I will say mkdir, that's make directory, same for Mac or Windows users, and I'm just going to make a new folder on my desktop to contain all the Django code that we're going to be working with for this particular section of the course. If you already have a folder like that, you can just change directory into that folder. But what I will do is I will say my Django stuff. So I will make that directory and then I will cd into my Django stuff, and there I have it. So I have that directory made, and what I will do now is just add that to Atom. So I will say file, add a project folder, go to my desktop, my Django stuff is there, select that folder, and I can see it here now. Great. So now let's actually create that first project using that Django-admin command line tool. Before I do that though, I'm going to want to activate the virtual environment I created in the previous lecture. If you're not using a virtual environment, that's okay, just make sure you've installed Django. So I will say activate. Remember, if you're using Mac or Linux, you want to say source activate, and then the name of the Django environment. And that one was just called my Django env, hit enter, and now that's activated. And then what I'm going to do is call the Django command line tool. I will say Django-admin start project, and then whatever you want to call this very first project we're working on. In this case, I'll keep it simple and just say first_project. Hit enter, and this is actually going to create that first project. So what you will notice now is in this directory, I've created my first project here. And here I have the first project folder, and you should have a nested folder of the same name, and then a couple files, that init.py file, settings.py, urls.py, wsgi, and then manage.py. What we're going to do now is take a little bit of time to explain what each of these files does. And you'll notice that one of them is empty. That's okay, that's the way it should be. And what I want you to do is check out these various files as I go along back to the presentation and explain in very brief detail what all of these files actually are doing. Let's hop back to the presentation. Okay, so here are the command lines we just initiated. And after that, we should get something like this. So let's take a little bit of time to explain what's actually going on here. Let's go first through that init.py file. So that __init__.py file, that's actually just a blank Python script, and due to its special name, it lets Python know that this directory can be treated as a package. Then we have the settings.py file, and this is where we're actually going to be storing all of our project settings. Then we have the urls.py file, and this is essentially a Python script that's going to store all the URL patterns for your project. And that's basically going to relate to the different pages of your web application and how they should connect to the end user. Now keep in mind, this particular file is really going to make a lot of use of regular expressions. So before tackling this urls.py file in future lectures, make sure you review the regular expressions lecture from the Python section of this course. Then we have that wsgi.py file, and that's a Python script that acts as the web server gateway interface. And essentially what it's going to help us with is later on, when we actually want to deploy our web app to production on some online server, that file is going to help us out there. Then we have the manage.py, and that's under that top directory. And this is a Python script that we're going to be using a lot. It's going to be associated with many of the commands we use as we build our web project and web application. Okay, so now let's actually use manage.py. In your command line, what I want you to do is, after activating your virtual environment, of course, type python space manage.py space run server. So here what we can actually see what's happening is we're calling Python to run that manage.py file, and off of that py file, we actually want to specifically call that run server command. And what you're going to see is a bunch of stuff, but at the bottom, you should see something that looks like this. Your particular version of Django, the settings you're using, and then it's starting a development server at a URL. And what you will do is copy and paste that URL into your browser, and you should now see your very first web page being locally hosted on your computer. And that's a big congratulatory step because you now just ran your very first Django project. Let me walk you through all of that back at the Atom text editor. All right, we're back at the Atom text editor, and before I run that python manage.py run server command, I want to make sure I'm in the right directory so that I can actually find it when I call it. So notice here that if I collapse that folder, it's under my Django stuff under first project, that very first folder. So what I will do here is cd to that first project folder, and here's where I'm going to call that actual command. I will say python manage.py run server, and then hit enter and actually run this. Okay, so you'll notice I get some outputs here, and sometimes you'll actually get a warning in red coloring. But here, due to this newer version of Django, it's not such a noticeable red warning, but it will tell you that you have some unapplied migrations. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. More importantly, we see here that it's starting the development server at this particular URL. So what I want you to do is copy this, just right-click that and copy it, or just type it straight into your browser and put it into your browser. All right, so I've jumped to my browser and I've typed in that URL, and you'll get something that looks like this. It worked. Congratulations on your first Django-powered page. So this is pretty awesome. We actually have something running locally on our computer, and it says Welcome to Django as the title. And of course, we haven't actually done any work yet, but the next step is to actually start our first application by running something that looks like this, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But a quick little message, it'll say something like, you're seeing this because you have debug is equal to true. So in our Django settings file, we actually have a debug option that we can set to true or false. And we'll talk about that later on in future lectures. And as we build our website, we'll always have it to true. But when we want to actually push something to production, we'll make sure to turn it to false. So that way, if an error arises, the user doesn't have access to our debugging tools with Django. Okay, now what I want to talk about is that migrations warning. So if I minimize this and come back to right here in Atom, we see we have 13 unapplied migrations. Let's take a little bit of time to discuss what migrations actually are and how they relate to the database when you're using Django. All right, so as we just noted, we have our very first Django-powered application or project running locally in our computer, so a big congratulations to you, pat yourself on the back. But as I mentioned, we noticed that warning about migrations, and this has to do with databases and how to connect them to Django. The question arises, what is a migration? Well, a migration allows you to move databases from one design to another. And this is also reversible, and that's why it's called a migration. Let's say you have a database and you want to edit a new field or add something like a new column. You can go ahead and migrate those changes over. And you can actually reverse that as well. So you can migrate your database. We're going to touch back on this later, especially when we actually talk about connecting Django to a database. But for now, you can ignore this warning. I know it says in that command prompt to run some sort of migrations command at the command line. Right now, we'll just back off on this and keep it in the back of our minds. So that was it as far as the basics of getting started with Django. We started our first Django project, but up next, we're going to continue by creating a very simple Hello World Django application. I hope you're excited because now we're actually going to get right into the nitty-gritty of working with Django. Thanks everyone, and I will see you at the next lecture.